Okay, so now we want to shift gears and examine how the pandemic might influence the larger global political order by resetting, potentially, U.S. China relations. And we want to start this conversation with a brief review of where U.S. China relations stood in November of 2019. We already talked about some of the important components of this relationship in prior modules. Now, this conversation focused on the implications of China's rise. Over the last 40 years, the sustained growth of the Chinese economy, which is now the second largest economy in the world, has helped to foster greater Chinese political influence around the world. This rise has triggered questions about declining U.S. influence, the possibility of a larger political or military conflict between the United States and China, and questions about which country might take a leadership role over the larger global order. President Obama initiated a larger reorientation in American grand strategy toward East Asia in his second term. This shift was designed to strengthen political relationships with countries that surrounded China and to create strategic opportunities to contain expanding Chinese political influence if that became necessary. President Trump also sought to confront China's rise, but he did it in a different manner. Specifically, he initiated a trade war with China marked by waves of tariff increases that cut trade between the two countries. Trump is trying to pressure Chinese government into opening its markets to American exports, while cutting U.S. imports of Chinese manufacturing products, so as to strengthen U.S. manufacturing here at home. Now, in this section, we are going to take this shift in the distribution of power between the two countries as a given. We want to ask, though, if this COVID-19 crisis might trigger a broader reorientation in the political interests each country holds relative to the other. Up until this point, both countries have recognized their common interests in both preserving the trading relationship and in avoiding a broader military and strategic rivalry. However, can this continue? Or will the COVID-19 crisis promote a much deeper hostility between the two countries? Now, alarmingly, public opinion polls in the United States in the past month demonstrate a rapid collapse in favorable views held by the U.S. public toward the Chinese government. Many U.S. politicians may cultivate this shift in the larger blame game currently being played over the responsibility for this pandemic. And the coming elections will give candidates for congressional races lots of opportunities to so-called get tough with China. It's important to realize that this relationship was improving just before the outbreak of COVID-19. The Trump administration and China signed a phase one trade deal in January that eased access for American exports into China. Most importantly, the president was going to rely on this trade deal success to spark higher levels of economic growth in the United States and sell this agreement as a significant political and economic victory during the presidential campaign of 2020. So let's quickly watch a PBS video that summarizes the progress made in U.S.-China relations just before the coronavirus pandemic. Go ahead and run that clip.
After more than 2 years of escalating threats, tariffs, and trade wars, the U.S. and China signed a new trade deal today. As Nick Schifrin tells us, it is known as phase one of a potentially larger deal. But the administration, critics, and businesses all say it is crucial to make sure that it's enforced and that the reality matches the rhetoric.
Today, the world's two largest economies declared a partial truce.
Our efforts have yielded a transformative deal that will bring tremendous benefits to both countries. We have a great relationship with China.
Standing next to China's top negotiator, President Trump predicted the deal would begin fundamental reforms to China's economy.
This is the biggest deal anybody's ever seen. And it can lead to being a deal that's unprecedented because China has 1.5 billion people. And ultimately, in phase 2, we're going to be opening up China to all of your companies.
Under the deal, China agrees to purchase $200 billion over the next 2 years of U.S. agriculture, energy, manufacturing, and financial services. And the administration says China promised to protect U.S. companies' intellectual property, stop forcing American companies to transfer technology to access Chinese markets, and lift financial service barriers. But China has pledged many of those reforms before and has a history of failing to buy as much as it promises. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has supported the administration's China policy goals, but says this agreement failed to go far enough.
The agreement does not address the Chinese government's massive subsidies to support domestic industries, devastating global markets, and eroding American competitiveness.
For months, the Trump administration and China have targeted each other with tariffs that hurt the Chinese economy and U.S. farmers and raise some consumer prices. As part of the deal, the U.S. reduced some tariffs, but maintained most of the tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of goods already imposed. President Trump said those tariffs and new enforcement language would guarantee that China won't break its promises.
We have full, again, the word, one of the strongest things we have, total and full enforceability. And you know what that means. Total, full enforceability.
Reaching a bigger agreement depends on how both countries follow through. President Trump said today he expects further negotiations to begin next month. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Okay, so it looks like we have real progress in the U.S. China relationship with the completion of the Phase 1 trade pact in January of this year. And then the COVID-19 panic hits, changes the world, and raises deeper challenges for the U.S. China relationship and the Trump administration. Again, it's important to emphasize that Trump was going to hold up this trade deal as a political win to U.S. voters that demonstrated his capacity to confront and secure concessions from China, to show his strategy for dealing with the rise of China was being successful. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic is going to make it a lot harder for him to do that. On the one hand, he has been cautious about confronting China in the last month over its failure to contain the outbreak because he doesn't want to endanger that trade pact. President Trump needs China to buy lots of American exports, and the purchase of those exports has grown more important in the aftermath of the economic collapse associated with this pandemic. On the other hand, as public support for China has fallen, election pressures are likely to encourage President Trump to take a harder line against China. In other words, the decision to rely on the trade deal as a political win has put the president into a bit of a political box right now, where his freedom of action to blame China for the pandemic is somewhat constrained. You can make an argument that this has led the administration to go after the WHO instead, cutting its funding a few weeks ago. Next, we're going to watch a couple of clips from a recent Financial Times interview with Ian Bremmer about the state of U.S. China relations and the larger global order. So let's go ahead and run that first clip.
And what does all this mean for the U.S. China relationship? I mean, the trade war started long before the outbreak of COVID-19, and we've had Trump calling it the Chinese virus. This is a volatile relationship anyway. Is this the kind of crisis that could tip them over the edge, or is it an opportunity for them to work together, and could you see that happening?
It's certainly not an opportunity. I mean, you'd like it to be. It's a global virus. It doesn't even come from humans. It comes from animals. So if there's ever a crisis you'd want to see the Americans and Chinese coordinating a response, it would be this. And the Chinese will need the West in short order because they'll probably be ahead of the United States and Europe in terms of treatment. But for a vaccine, that's not going to come from China. That's going to come from the West. It's probably going to come from the United States. So they're going to need help. And it's going to be unfortunate if the relationship is as broken as it is today or worse. Now, you already mentioned that Trump has referred to the virus as the China virus, but of course he stopped after he talked to Xi Jinping. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, particularly on banging the drum on the Wuhan virus, He stopped too because he was ordered to by Trump. Now, in part, this is a wait and see mode for the United States because Trump's approval ratings are comparatively high right now. He's gotten a bit of a bump because everyone's in panic mode and he's dominating the airwaves. But as the U.S. unemployment spikes through, say, 15%, and the markets continue to take these big hits, you certainly think that the impact on Trump's approval ratings in an election cycle is going to be significant. It's going to be downward and significant. And then he's going to want to blame people more. China will be that place. Also, as you mentioned, there were big problems between the U.S. and China before all of this, not just on trade, but on technology, a decoupling between the United States and China. We say no business with Huawei or ZTE, and our allies better not do it either, or we're going to punish you. We won't cooperate with you on intelligence. For example, the UK saw a lot of that. And the Chinese, of course, weren't allowing companies like Google or Amazon or Facebook or Twitter to operate in China. So that was a decoupling of a big piece of the global economy. Well, we're now going to see that decoupling deepen and broaden to include manufacturing sectors, service sectors. I mean, as you see Western corporations get bailouts from the governments, and particularly the United States, some of them maybe even being nationalized because otherwise they go bankrupt. The conditionality will be you've got to hire a lot of Americans. They're going to reduce their footprint in China. They don't like the just-in-time supply chain. It's very profitable, but it's also very disruptible, as we see. So they're going to want to have supply chains that are closer to the customers. All of that means less interdependence between the Americans and the Chinese at a time that there's no trust between these two countries.
Okay, so we want to make 3 points from this video. First, note the restraint that Bremmer sees in the U.S. response to China in the last month. Again, the President of the United States has to walk a fine line here because of that trade deal that Trump finalized with China and its potential importance to his re-election campaign. Second, note that he talks about how the elections in the United States are complicating this relationship right now. In order to deflect blame from their own failures, U.S. politicians on both sides of the aisle are likely to try and shift blame and responsibility for this pandemic onto the Chinese government. Now, this rhetoric and blaming might grow over the next 7 months. We have to watch, though, and think about the long-term implications of this. This growth in hostility, which is stoked by electoral pressures, could endure past the election, and that raises deeper concerns about the failure of U.S.-Chinese relations. Now, third, note that Bremmer sees a broader decoupling between the United States and China from this crisis. This also has implications for the shared economic interests that both states hold relative to each other. He thinks that about the coming pressure from inside the United States to remake global supply chains and bring more manufacturing capacity back home to the United States from China. This pandemic has raised concerns about the cost of securing medical equipment and pharmaceutical drugs from China, for example. We should expect that U.S. politicians will leverage bailouts and future economic support for U.S. businesses to pressure them to bring more manufacturing back into the United States. Again, the U.S. government will exercise this leverage through bailouts by sometimes taking ownership positions in U.S. industries that get public aid. Now we want to step back slightly and ask what these potential changes in U.S.-China relations might mean for the larger global political order. And we will watch 2 more clips from the Bremmer interview. Specifically, Bremmer is asked to think about where leadership is going to come from to solve some of these global challenges created by this crisis. So let's go ahead and run those clips now.
So I want to start with the U.S. Has the Trump administration shown leadership on the global stage during this crisis? And if not, where is that leadership coming from? Is it international institutions like the World Health Organization, or is there a power vacuum?
It's pretty clear the United States has not shown global leadership. I mean, mostly the questions I'm getting about President Trump right now are to what extent he's showing domestic leadership and where he's failed in the United States. But certainly internationally, and that's a mixed answer, but internationally, the United States has been absent. So radically different than after 9/11, so radically different than after the 2008-2009 financial crisis. This is a United States that is increasingly not aligned and not trusted by its allies. It's one that's blaming China, and I understand why the U.S. is blaming China, but this is a time when we need coordination and cooperation. It's an America that's paying more attention to its borders and more attention to its own multinationals. So it's really a move away from globalization. And I think that's been largely true for the Europeans, also hit very badly and in the teeth of this crisis right now. You could make the argument that the Chinese, to the extent that leadership is being provided, it's coming from China. And obviously it's easier to say that, number one, because they're restarting their economy, and by May, their supply chain will be fully operational when the Americans and Europeans are still shut down. Plus, the Chinese are responsible for most of the key supply chain for relevant pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. So, I mean, given all of that, easier for China to provide some leadership, but nowhere close to what we would have seen from the Americans historically. The China very good at blowing their own horn in terms of propagandizing just how much they're doing for all these countries and making sure that every piece of humanitarian aid, every member of medical personnel that's going to Europe or going to emerging markets is being well covered. But really, the answer is that there's a profound vacuum. This is the first G0 global crisis.
Going back to the big picture here, how do you think this crisis will affect the world order? Do the previous dynamics that existed before the coronavirus outbreak, like the U.S. China trade war, like the rise of strongman politics in Latin America, do these dynamics just fall to the side? And is you sort of starting from scratch when this is over? Or how do you see that world order shaping?
Well, as I said, I mean, I'm not someone who believed that we had the American order coming into this. I mean, I first wrote about the coming G0 world about 8 years ago, and the idea that the United States no longer wanted to provide the global leadership as the world's sheriff militarily, or as the architect of global trade, or even as the cheerleader of global values. But that's less obvious absent a crisis than it is right now, when it's put on very bold and vivid display. So I think coming out of this, you're going to see an intensification of that reality, that the Chinese are going to have much more influence in terms of soft power, in terms of tech power, in terms of economic power, and the willingness of other countries, including American allies, to hedge towards them. Most importantly, in descending order, that'll be Southeast Asia, then Sub-Saharan Africa, then East and Southern Europe, and that means that Europe is going to feel much more divided, and then Latin America. So that's clearly something you'll see. You'll see a move away from globalization towards regionalization, local supply chains, more nationalism, more populism as a consequence. And then the big question is whether we end up in a U.S. China Cold War. And again, we're trending in that direction, but I wouldn't make that argument quite yet.
Ian Bremmer, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Okay, so we want to make 4 points from these clips. First, note that Bremmer sees an absence of leadership in this crisis. And this distinguishes this crisis from prior ones associated with the attacks on 9/11 and the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. He says we've entered a G0 world. Second, he talks a lot about the move away from globalization. And the implication here is as economies decouple, this could hurt global economic growth in the long run by depriving businesses in all countries of new export opportunities. And there's an important parallel here, I think, to the Great Depression. The Great Depression became the Great Depression. It started as a recession, in part because governments around the world rapidly moved to decouple themselves from each other in economic terms. They cut trade with each other. They limited the movement of capital flows and borrowing across national boundaries. And what that did was it turned a localized recession into a larger Great Depression. So think about this in the context of how the world might emerge from this the economic shocks associated with this pandemic over the next couple of years. If there's a significant push away from globalization, this could hamper economic recoveries and make the downturn even longer. Third, I think we need to talk some about why the absence of leadership is so important in the current crisis. And let's work through the slide that you see now on board. And let's just step back, and Bremmer talks it, he assumes as if cooperation is necessary to get ourselves out of this pandemic, both the public health challenges and the economic challenges. And so let's think about that a little bit and ask ourselves, right, why do we need global cooperation? Why does the United States, or why should the United States be working with the governments of the United Kingdom and Italy and Spain and Germany and China and Japan to try and develop cooperative solutions to this crisis? And I think the first thing to realize is that this is a global challenge that requires the coordination and cooperation of policy responses. And we can think about this in terms of an externality. What's an externality? An externality is a cost or benefit that falls on outside actors that aren't necessarily engaged with a direct relationship. So in this case, right, the public health challenges that begin in Wuhan create an externality for the rest of the world. When the Chinese government doesn't contain the spread of COVID-19 in Wuhan, it creates problems for Italy. It creates problems for the United States, for the United Kingdom, right? For local officials here in Austin. And so the presence of these externalities that demonstrate how a crisis in one country can quickly spread over into other countries, it demonstrates the lack of capacity of borders to stop things. And then it then creates a greater responsibility on governments to try to coordinate their responses to mitigate the negative downward shocks from these developments, right? And again, let's talk back briefly about the Great Depression here. And one of the reasons that the Great Depression became the Great Depression, as I just mentioned, was because the absence of cooperation to manage the economic shocks that begin to emerge in 1927 and 1928. Governments turned inward. It led to a deeper economic collapse. And this deeper economic collapse transformed political interests within Europe. Sorry, you're going to say something, Rob?
No, go ahead.
Okay. And so this created a larger long-term political shock that shifted political interests throughout the world, and where populist pressures emerge, and we see the rise of nationalism, partly as a function of the inability of governments to cooperate to solve the economic challenges that emerge in 1927 and 1928. So that's the case for why cooperation is necessary. We have these externalities. We've got historical analogies that suggest the absence of cooperation is really bad. Now let's ask, what does cooperation look like in this crisis? So in the first part, you can think about the coordination of public health challenges, the sharing of knowledge with respect to treatment and vaccines. The developing world is going to need some substantial economic support here, right? So they don't have outbreaks that then come back to the developed world. Everybody needs access to medical supplies, and this access to medical supplies needs to be coordinated. So this is one of the problems in the United States that we face right now, and that this is continually being talked about. We don't have sufficient testing capacity. Well, why don't we have sufficient testing capacity in the United States? Because the whole world is competing for the chemical reagents that are necessary to perform these tests. And so the shortage of these reagents is constraining U.S. testing capacity. So there needs to be some coordination among governments to share access to these scarce resources to ensure that you have testing capacity where you're most likely to need it. The governments of the world are going to have to share access to food supplies and potentially coordinate access to food supplies as this moves into the developing world as well. These medical challenges illustrate, so let's think, what international organization generally plays an important coordinating role in managing the sharing of medical knowledge? It's the World Health Organization and vaccines and the like. Well, so what's happened in the last 3 weeks? President Trump has withdrawn support for the World Health Organization. temporarily, potentially harming its ability to perform these public goods functions. And so we have to ask, well, is the U.S. going to step into the role and play the role and perform the functions provided by the WHO? If not, this creates some deeper problems for the larger international system. Now, let's separate this function that the WHO provides to the larger global economy from the political blame game. That's a separate thing. The larger issue is, and there is some legitimate beefs here on the part of the U.S. administration, and whether or not the WHO has been as transparent as possible. To be fair to the WHO, we know that U.S. scientists were embedded within the WHO from the beginning. There should have been lots of intelligence coming back to the U.S. administration about this. But I want to separate that, the politics of blaming and the role played by the WHO, to the larger issue of, if the WHO is kneecapped in this crisis, who's going to step up and play the larger functional role that this international organization provides in coordinating medical responses across the world? So we need to have some coordination in the public health response. We also need some coordination in the economic response. What does this mean? Governments should be coordinating fiscal relief, their tax bailouts. We need to see coordination in monetary policy to prevent financial crises. We know from the Great Depression, if governments don't coordinate their trade policies and everybody embraces protectionism to change global supply chains, we could have a larger economic contraction. All of this, right? The point here we want to make is we need some global cooperation to get us out of this crisis. And we have to ask, right, where does the leadership come from that's capable of engineering this cooperation in the international system right now? Go ahead, Rob.
Something here. One thing that I want to note here is how difficult cooperation is in this current crisis. Realize that one of the biggest responses to this crisis is to cut ties and especially travel between countries, right? And so one of the ways to protect countries right now from the spread of COVID-19, or when they are countries that get COVID-19 under control, one of the first things they have to worry about is actually reintroducing the virus because of connections, travel, trade, and the like with other countries that don't have the virus under control. And so there is a certain sort of environment here in which countries are naturally going to withdraw a bit from the global community and from globalization as a response to the crisis itself. And so what we're talking about in terms of coordinating all of these things, which is exactly right, is happening in a time and in an environment where political officials and the mass publics are kind of appropriately questioning the costs of globalization. And so we have to, I think, acknowledge how difficult cooperation, in particular in this particular crisis, it is, right? And so I just heard an official on the news the other day talking about we can't go back to the kind of global supply chains that we had before because they're too vulnerable to a crisis like this. And we're always fighting the previous crisis. And so one of the things I think that's going to hold back some of this necessary cooperation is specifically the kinds of problems that have been shown in a globalized world and vulnerability to something like COVID-19 and the coronavirus epidemic, right? Is that globalization helps to fuel the very crisis that we need globalization and global cooperation to help overcome.
So we're going to finish today by bringing us back to a theory that we've talked multiple times about, and this helps us to kind of summarize things and in terms of thinking about the future of the global political order and the role that U.S.-China relations play in this order. And let's just bring us back to hegemonic stability theory that suggests that remember, the primary claim of hegemonic stability theory is the concentration of economic and political power provides public goods to the international system. And on some levels, the conversation today validates hegemonic stability theory, right? Because what's it doing? It's making a prediction that a shift in the distribution of power in which the hegemon declines leads to the decline of or limitations on international cooperation. And what Bremmer made the argument, we're moving to a G0 world. We don't see the U.S. Playing a leadership role in the current crisis. Well, guess what? Hegemonic stability theory predicts that. As the U.S. influence, as the U.S. responsibility for global economic activity declines, remember, this is a structural shift, we should see less interest on the part of the United States in supplying these public goods. And so hegemonic stability theory helps to explain what Bremmer is talking about here. But now I want us to think a little bit and push back, or think about a way where we could push back against Bremmer's arguments. And let's go back to the last in the news segment where we talked about the role of the Federal Reserve. And we made the case then that the opposite is happening. When we're talking about monetary policy that's designed to prevent a global financial crisis, we see the preservation of U.S. influence through the Federal Reserve. We see the Federal Reserve aggressively confronting this crisis and trying to minimize the economic costs of the slowdown. And so the larger point here we want to make is, right, we can debate these things. There's some evidence that support that hegemonic stability theory might help us understand this transition. We see some pushback by the Federal Reserve, but we want to get you thinking about how the COVID-19 pandemic might alter the larger global order, right? Is this going to hasten the decline of the United States relative to China? Is it going to trigger a deeper political conflict between the two? Or alternatively, and again, let's come back to how President Trump and President Xi have behaved in the last month. They've signaled that they want to try and prevent a spillover and a deeper political conflict emerging between the two countries. They both have economic incentives to do that, right? Trump wants to tout the trade deal as a win that will help him get reelected. And in the same sense, President Xi, he's got the Chinese economy needs to recover as well. And where's the biggest consumer market in the world? It's in the United States. And we can make a case, right, that we have these common economic interests that have stabilized the relationship, at least among the governments at the highest levels. The question is whether or not this can be sustained.
Right. I mean, what's interesting is that the pandemic crisis is causing a lot of incentives to the blame game, right, on both sides of the U.S. and China. But the subsequent economic recovery will really have a lot of incentives for cooperation because both sides still need each other for that economic recovery. It'll be much easier for the United States to recover if it has a supply chain from China and also that huge Chinese market. And the same goes for China and the United States. And so as we shift to the mitigation of the COVID-19 crisis and controlling the virus to trying to tackle the economic recovery and the damage that was created by it, there might be more incentives for cooperation.